Why France panicked when these letters were found on. There are moments when history rises, not with gunfire, not with elections, not with revolutions, but with a whisper that refuses to die. What began as a routine archaeological survey beneath an abandoned French outpost in Burkina Faso has now become one of the most profound reckonings in modern African memory. More than 200 letters, written by African soldiers who fought and died under the French flag between 1943 and 1961, were discovered sealed, dust-covered, and undelivered. Words intended for mothers, wives, and children, hidden for generations. When Ibrahim Traoré read them, he did not call for outrage. He simply said, if their voices were once too dangerous to be heard, then the world must hear them now. Tonight, we take you through the emotional, political, and historical earthquake that followed. If you value truth-driven storytelling, subscribe now, because this is not just history, this is memory returning home. The discovery began with a group of university volunteers mapping remnants of colonial structures across northern Burkina Faso. Most sites were empty shells, crumbling foundations, rusted metal, discarded documents too damaged to matter. But one ruin was different. Beneath a broken concrete slab, a wooden trapdoor lay buried under layers of sand. When the students forced it open, stale air rushed upward, thick with the scent of age and silence. Inside, they saw boxes, fragile, termite-bitten, but intact. Within them, envelopes worn thin by time, ink faded, handwriting trembling across decades. More than 200 letters, all written by African soldiers conscripted into French wars. None had reached the people they were meant for. When the boxes reached the presidential office, the reaction surprised his cabinet. President Ibrahim Traoré didn't call for a meeting. He didn't summon historians or diplomats. He simply requested the room be cleared. For hours, he sat alone reading every letter, each one a doorway into a forgotten universe. Men fighting in snow they had never seen, serving a nation that never called them citizens, writing to families who would wait their entire lives for messages that never came. When Traoré finally spoke, his voice was steady. Their silence was manufactured, he said, but memory can be revived. The decision that followed was unprecedented. Instead of withholding the letters for diplomatic review, the government digitized every page and released them globally within days. The platform, titled La Voix Perdue, The Lost Voice, allowed readers from across Africa and Europe to scroll through the words of men once erased from history. Each letter carried not only emotion, but testimony. A Burkina soldier described patching wounded comrades while being denied entry into the officer's tent because of his skin. Another wrote about freezing nights on the front lines of Alsace, confessing that he feared death less than being forgotten. One wrote simply, "If my voice does not reach you, let my truth reach someone." The reaction in France was instant and divided. Government officials urged caution, calling for contextual review. But French citizens, especially younger generations, responded differently. Social media filled with posts recognizing African names that had appeared only faintly in family stories. Students in Paris began reading the letters publicly in parks. A granddaughter of a retired French general wrote, "We cannot speak of French victory without acknowledging African blood." The archives had become a mirror, and France was slowly, reluctantly, looking into it. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, the impact was electric. Radio stations began dedicating entire nights to reading the letters aloud, allowing even illiterate families to hear the voices of their ancestors. Schools replaced 1 week of curriculum with community discussions about forgotten regiments. Elders who had remained silent for decades began sharing memories, fragments of names, faces, and friends lost in Algeria or Indochina. Entire villages learned, for the first time, that their uncles and grandfathers had not vanished into rumor, but into a bureaucracy that had decided their words were unnecessary. Then came an unexpected twist. An 83-year-old woman in Marseille contacted a Burkina journalist after recognizing a handwriting sample published online. Among her late father's belongings, she had discovered an unopened letter addressed to a woman named Fatoumata in Burkina Faso. Inside was a photograph of a young African soldier standing beside a French child. Her family had never known who he was. Now, she realized his name was among the long-buried letters. The photo spread across Europe and Africa, challenging the notion that this was merely a political dispute. It was a story of human connection, severed by colonial structures, now rejoined by truth. Pressure grew as historians, journalists, and activists began uncovering more evidence of systemic erasure. Several French military archives showed gaps where African regiments should have appeared. A retired pilot confessed on radio that African troops had been deliberately excluded from post-war honors to preserve a narrative of European heroism. French museums, independent at first, began releasing previously locked documents. Suddenly, the letters were not isolated accidents. They were part of a pattern. Inside the presidential palace, advisors urged Traoré to take advantage of the moment. Some suggested demanding reparations. Others advised seeking a formal apology from Paris. But Traoré surprised them all. He announced the creation of an international initiative titled Letters That Lived, dedicated not to political leverage, but to restoring the letters to the families of their authors, translating them into African languages, and submitting them to UNESCO's Memory of the World Archive. It was a moral gesture, not a diplomatic attack. The French government, caught off balance, sent a discreet envoy to Ouagadougou with a simple message. We are listening. No cameras, no speeches, just quiet recognition. It was the first sign that the letters had begun to reshape the narrative, not through confrontation, but through conscience. The movement grew beyond borders. In Senegal, Mali, and Côte d'Ivoire, families began bringing out old medals, photos, and fragments of uniforms. In France, university students formed reading circles reciting the letters in both French and African languages. Historians launched new research projects. Descendants on both sides of history began discovering shared roots. Traoré then announced something entirely new: the gathering of forgotten regiments, a summit without political speeches or national flags held at the very site where the letters were found. People arrived from across continents: descendants, poets, veterans, students, archivists. Traoré walked onto the platform alone, carrying 3 original letters written by Burkina soldiers who never returned. He read them aloud, not as a president, but as a grandson of the forgotten. The moment that stunned the world came when a French woman stepped forward holding the old photograph she had found. She recognized the man in Traoré's hands. Their families had been tied together by war, separated by history, reunited by memory. The two embraced, and for a moment, politics vanished. Only humanity remained. By the end of the summit, no treaties had been signed, no demands issued. And yet, something profound had shifted. French media began acknowledging African sacrifices previously ignored. Museums committed to permanent exhibits. African schools began teaching colonial military history with newfound clarity. The letters had revived not just memory, but dignity. The story rippled across continents. Indigenous communities in Latin America reclaimed long-dismissed oral histories. Asian families of colonial laborers launched public archives. The letters had become a global call to unseal the past. And through it all, Traoré refused to turn remembrance into leverage. He visited schools, reading letters aloud. He encouraged families to share their stories. He reminded the world that restoration cannot begin with blame. It must begin with truth.